Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is the author of the novel The Singer Sisters, which is a work of fiction about a family of folk singers. Her writing work also includes numerous short stories, as well as political and cultural articles for publications like the New York Times, The Nation, Cosmopolitan, and Glamour. Her name is Sarah Marian Seltzer, and my interview with Sarah will follow the note-taking sounds. Sarah Seltzer, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah. I'm coming at you from New York City, just a few blocks north of Central Park in Harlem. I'm a writer, editor, mother of two very energetic little boys, and I've lived in New York most of my life. And the book I'm talking about that came out this summer is called The Singer Sisters. It's a family novel about a family of folk and rock and roll singers in the 1960s and the 1990s. Those are two very fun decades for writing about music. So that's me.
As your novel is called The Singer Sisters, without spoiling too much of your novel, what is it about?
So it's about a mother and a daughter. So it's two timelines. The daughter is a kind of rock and roll gal in the 1990s. So think about like Alanis Morissette and Jewel and Lilith Fair, that whole vibe. And her parents and her aunt were all folkies in the 1960s. In Greenwich Village. And so we're talking about like sort of the Bob Dylan, Joan Baez era of music. And Emma, as she gets closer and closer to fame, and she really wants to be famous because she wants to eclipse her parents, she learns more and more about her family's secrets and the things that they've been keeping from her. And so the book follows both Emma's story as she kind of hits it big time, and then her mother's story in the 1960s, and it shows why her mom gave up music for a time, and which Emma never understood. So there's a lot of secrets, there's a lot of fame, there's a lot of heartbreak and misunderstandings, and there's also a lot of songs in the book. The lyrics are included, so it's a rock and roll family saga.
What motivated you to write a novel about a family of singers?
Great question. So I actually did see a family of singers perform together. It was at Pete Seeger's 90th birthday concert at Madison Square Garden. And the family was a pair of Canadian folk singers named Kate and Anna McGarrigle. And Kate's kids are Rufus and Martha Rainwright, who have kind of rock and roll singer-songwriter careers of their own. And I just love the idea of an entire family who are all in the same business, and the business being the music business. So I kind of kept that idea around for a long time before I sat down and decided to write this book. But it was, it just once I saw them perform together, I knew that it had the makings of a novel.
Is it true that you wrote your own rock lyrics for the Singer Sisters? And if so, what was it like to write your own rock lyrics for a novel?
Yes, I did. It was extremely fun. I mean, it's different from writing fiction. It's different from writing poetry. You kind of have to have a little bit of music in your head, even though I'm not a musician or, particularly musically talented. But it was just very fun to think about some of my favorite songs from both eras, and to then kind of imagine what a song that my characters would sing would sound like, and also to try and get some of their emotions out and their secrets and their interior life and their communication with each other out through those lyrics. So it was probably the most purely fun part of writing the book, was writing the lyrics.
How long did it take you to write your novel?
So the novel, from start to finish, from let's say the day I picked up my first notebook to the day it was published, was almost 7 years. But it was not all of those years were writing. There was some waiting. So there was like this COVID pandemic. I don't know if you've heard of it, that happened in the middle. So there was a good long break in the middle. So I think I wrote for about 2 years. Then there was a long break. Then I wrote again for another year. Then I got my agent. Then there was a lot of sort of back and forth, waiting with my agent, editing with my agent, then waiting with my editor, and then editing with my editor. So I would say like 3.5 to 4 years of writing over 7 years.
Most of the time when I interview a guest for this podcast, it's an independent author, an author who goes the hybrid publishing route, or an author who gets published by a small traditional press. But your novel was published by a major traditional publishing house. How were you able to get the Singer Sisters published by a major traditional publisher?
Well, I was just very, very lucky that my agent, she's an excellent agent at the time. She had her own very small publishing house. She was referred to me by a friend. So I didn't have to go through the whole agonizing process of querying. And I should say to your listeners that I had gone through that process with a previous project or two, and no luck. So I know how difficult it can be. And so in this case, it was basically a match that was made between me and my agent, by this mutual friend who knew that my agent had been a performer and a singer herself. So she would like the subject matter of the book. And then similarly, my agent and I actually knew my editor from social media a little bit, and my agent and my editor had a good relationship, but they had never worked together. And it was sort of a very convenient and happy match for everyone involved. So I recognize how lucky I am. I was published by a wonderful publishing house with a great team, but I wasn't their number one lead title. They published huge authors at my publishing house, like the horror writer Leigh Bardugo and a bunch of thriller writers who get, tons and tons of attention. And I am not a horror or thriller writer, and I don't, have a huge audience, but I still what I felt so lucky about with the big press is just the book ended up in so many bookstores. It really, when the book came out, I had friends sending me pictures from like their summer beach vacations, like the local bookstores, and it was distributed really widely. And so and they also gave me a beautiful cover, and they were wonderful to work with. So I feel really, really gratified. Who knows what my publishing future will be, and whether I'll end up doing something smaller and weirder with a small press someday. I have plenty of friends who have done hybrid, who have done university presses, small presses, micro presses, zines, the entire spectrum of publishing. And I think each has its advantages and disadvantages.
Was the querying and publishing process the hardest part of your journey to becoming an author, or was there an even harder part for you?
That's a great question. I think the hardest part for me, well, there may be two hardest parts. The hardest part in some ways was just persevering and like continuing to work on the project with everything that life threw at me and throws at all of us. For instance, I had a baby in the middle of writing it. I had my second kid. I moved. I had family illnesses and COVID and work changes. So to just continue to keep working on it was very hard. And if I hadn't, one of the reasons I think the book is fun to read, at least for me, is that it was fun to write. If it hadn't been fun to write, I would have given up. So I think that was really important, that it was sort of a fun ride. But I also found it really challenging, to be honest, to the final few months before publication. I found very stressful when the book is coming out and you want to do something. You can't write anymore. There's no more copy edits. There's no more proofs to look at. But it's too early to try and do any publicity. It was just sort of very agonizing to just be kind of in that waiting period. And I hopefully will be more prepared for it if I publish another book. That part was difficult for me.
You've written numerous short stories in addition to your novel. What are some short stories that you've written?
That's a really great question. So before I started writing the novel, I, like many others, was an MFA student and working on my short stories. I wrote a bunch of short stories in sort of those years and the years immediately after my MFA. And interestingly enough, two of my short stories ended up leading to jobs, which is like crazy. I wrote a short story called, what was it called? It was about a wedding, a short story about a wedding, in the characters in their 20s. And I submitted it to the Flavor Wire fiction. Oh, Giving Grace Away. That was called. It's called Giving Grace Away, to the Flavor Wire fiction contest. And I think, I was one of the 5 stories chosen to be published. And then sort of that led to my having coffee with my friend who was an editor at Flavor Wire at the time. And he was like, by the way, I'm leaving my job. I'm going to give you a heads up. Like you should put your resume in before, as soon as the job listing goes live, get your application ready. So then I ended up working there for 3 years, and it was a really great job. So that was one short story. It's called Giving Grace Away. And another short story I wrote for a publication named Lilith is called Ironing. And that one, so Giving Grace Away is about a wedding. Ironing is about a 12-year-old girl who is embarrassed to have curly hair, and she goes out and steals her mom's money and goes out to buy a hair iron to flatten her hair. And that story won the Lilith fiction contest. And then I ended up several years later coming to work at Lilith because that story connected me with the editors, and I still work there today. So that goes to, I feel like that I'm, the short stories, I don't write them anymore. I would love to if I had more time, but they open doors. And I published a few others as well. I published a story in a print magazine called, that's no longer in print, called The Normal School. They have a website still. That is one of my favorites as well. So yeah, it was a fun period of time. Short stories are harder for me to write than the novel, I think.
You talked about the end of your previous response about how you feel that short stories, at least for you, are harder to write than a novel. How do you approach writing a short story differently than how you write a novel?
So in a short story, everything has to be really compressed, and you need a real payoff in a very short amount of time. And so there's a lot of skill involved in sort of setting up a situation that is sort of immediately sucks the reader in and opens with a bunch of questions, and then, has to at least answer some of those questions very quickly. So with short stories, I would say there's many, many more drafts, or there's a lot of drafts with a novel too, but so much of the process is thinking. It's a very thinky exercise. And for me, with a novel, I'm more feeling my way toward, you have more room to feel your way towards what you want to say, and experiment with your characters and stuff like that. So I find the novel easier in that way. And then eventually there's a ton of revision with a novel too. But I think with a short story, you have to really have a very a very focused idea and plan, at least for me when I write them.
You've also written numerous articles about various political and cultural topics, and some of the publications and outlets that have featured your articles include the New York Times, The Nation, Cosmopolitan, and Glamour, just to name a few. What are some topics and subjects that you've written articles about?
That's a great question. So I have written about all kinds of things. So I've written about, a lot of what I write about is about the intersection of culture and politics. So for instance, when I worked at Flavor Wire, every day I would write an article about something that was happening in pop culture and what the political impact of that was. So I would write about things like the movement to diversify children's literature, for instance, was one of the beats I covered. I would write about I wrote about films about, I wrote a piece about how yoga was showing up in pop culture all of a sudden everywhere on TV. I wrote a piece about depression and how it was being depicted on various TV shows and movies. And then some of the other bigger pieces I've written about, like for the New York Times, I wrote a piece about the death of the department store, and how department stores used to be a site for leisurely shopping, and people would eat in the in-house department store coffee shop and sort of spend a whole day together. And now everyone shops online, and that whole era is over. I've written a piece about how Jewish texts approach abortion differently from other faiths and have, a tradition of prioritizing the life of the mother and the health of the mother. So it's a whole variety of stuff. I'm what you call a generalist in terms of what I write. So I can do some in-depth reporting about. I did a lot of reporting during the Occupy Wall Street era and that whole era of activism on like what activists were doing and thinking. So I've done stuff like that that involves, following activists around, making lots of phone calls, doing some sort of investigations. And then I also write, funny essays about things I've seen in movies. So it really varies.
I am someone who is of the opinion that the entire music industry became unlistenable to and just genuinely terrible around 2000 or so. There was like a whole switch between pre 2000 ish music and afterward. And it was around the introduction of the iPod, which I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but it might have. Why do a lot of people, even people who were born late in or even after the late 20th century, still care about music from the time period from the 1960s to the 1990s?
That's a great question and a great point. So that is what you're talking about. That transition around the year 2000 is something that I expressly deal with in the book. In the novel, Emma, my character, becomes famous around, I think, the very, very late, very end of the 90s, sort of the end of the singer-songwriter, that particular singer-songwriter rock and roll alternative music era, which sort of that, and she's getting replaced by like boy bands and more manufactured pop stars, which, we all enjoy dancing to that music, but it's just very different from what she was doing, which is sort of heartfelt, very emotional, very lyrically driven music. And I think that, we're now seeing a revival of guitar music and singer-songwriter stuff now, but there was that sort of corporate period in the 2000s. And I think we all love the music from the 60s to the 90s because that was the invention of, that's when that form got pioneered. It's like why everyone still loves like Mozart and Beethoven when it comes to classical music, because they kind of like started like were the first people to really make it good and really make it immortal. And that's what Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez and all these people that we're now once again the culture is fascinated with right now in 2025 did for these self-written pop and folk rock songs. And so they set the scene for everything. And so there was this long period where that was all flourishing and they were influencing each other and pushing the art form further and further into, artsy genius territory. And it's the foundation for everything that's come since then. So I think that's one of the reasons we're fascinated by it and why we're fascinated by Greenwich Village in the 1960s and Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles in the late 60s, because they are, those artists are like the romantic poets or or the modernists. They are, they are the geniuses who changed culture forever. So I think you're right that there was a real change at the end of the 1990s. When that was sort of the end of that first wave, I think, of that kind of music.
And you even see this dichotomy in country music. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, you had like Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, Dolly Parton's more country pop, but her music celebrated by a lot of people as well. And then the 90s, you had the Alan Jacksons, the George Strait, and then around 2000 or so, the whole country genre just started being terrible.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think I am not an expert on this, but I think that there was a lot, there were a lot of forces at work sort of in the industry. There was the beginning of streaming and iPods, and corporate consolidation of the radio was a big part of it, I think. That radio stations used to be more independent, and so it was easier to find different artists and bring them up. So I think there were a lot of corporate things and industry things that happened in the 2000s that sort of ended some of the interesting experimentation that we saw in the 90s.
What has changed for women in music from the late 20th century to today?
That's a great question. I was recently one of the people who very kindly blurbed my book and has been, he was my chat conversation partner at my book launch in New York City is Rob Sheffield, who's a music critic for Rolling Stone and has written several books. And one of his most recent book is about Taylor Swift. And I was talking to him about my book and Taylor and sort of the Taylor era that we're in, the post-Taylor era, where she, and there has been a big change. I think you had in the 90s, you had this sort of brief flourishing of women in pop music, not just women singers, but women artists who were, in charge of their own sound and their own music and writing their own lyrics. But the reason that Lilith Fair even happened in the 90s was because Sarah McLachlan said it was so hard to get venues to book female artists, and that female artists still felt really disrespected and ignored by the industry. So they decided to kind of band together to show their strength. And it's taken a long time. So it's been like 30 years since that happened. And I think finally, thanks to artists like Beyonce and Taylor Swift, I would say those two are the big ones, but some others as well. There's finally been a bit of a breakthrough. And, this year we saw at the Grammys that almost all the Album of the Year nominees were female, and that there was a real, showcase of different kinds of female talent in music. So I'm sure there's always still sexism in the industry. And one of the things that my book covers is this idea that the more things change, the more they stay the same, that eras change and feminism, keeps pushing, but that individually, it still can be quite hard to be a woman in the spotlight. But finally, I do think that, and that's what I was chatting about with Rob after his Taylor Swift event, was that there's finally been some real forward momentum for women in music. And we'll have to see what happens, because we're now living in an era of real social and cultural backlash in general. So it's yet to be seen if those changes are permanent, but I'm hopeful that they are.
My last question for this interview: what is the best advice you could offer to aspiring artists, writers, and creatives?
So my advice is always a little different. So some people will tell you you have to, do your art or make your art every day. But the advice I always give people, and that I give to my students, because I also teach writing classes, is that you have to set small and realistic goals that you can actually achieve in addition to the big goals. So if you don't think you can really write every day, if you're someone like me and you have a day job and you have kids and you have, a life that makes it hard, you have to say, I will write when I can, and I'm going to try to write, 2 or 3 days a week. And when I do write, I'm going to focus in. I think that makes a huge difference in, I think that some of us get fed this idea that the artist has to have this, perfect space, studio or desk or, music equipment or whatever we need to make our art, and has to be undisturbed, and we have to be able to go there every single day. And that's just not realistic for most of us. So trying to be realistic while also not giving up, that's the challenge, I think, for all of us, is to fit it in and to make it a priority, but also recognize what we can actually do. And it'd be surprising. I mean, I wrote this book, a lot of it on my lunch hour, on my commute. Right after I, in sort of the 1 hour of coherence I had, mental coherence I had right after I put my kids to bed, like just in the margins of my life. And I think that's doable. At some point you always have to block out some time and maybe take a weekend to work on whatever it is, your story or your novel. But to start with, you can do it in the margins, and you shouldn't let that dream or that goal of being the all-consumed, devoted artist get in the way of doing a little bit at a time.
Sarah, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an awesome guest.
This was lovely, and you asked a really smart question, so thank you so much for having me.
It's fascinating to interview a guest who wrote her own rock music lyrics for a novel. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.